All right, let's get to soldering. Let's get to the assignments, right? Get to the good stuff. Okay, so here I have the practice board. Um, it has been stuck down with some blue tack or some sticky tack, that same stuff you use to stick posters on your wall. I prefer to solder with my piece flat on the table, basically. You can also use what are called helping hands. They basically clamp onto the piece with these little clips and hold the piece in different positions or in the air or something like that. Okay. I don't really like doing that. I don't like soldering in the air. I'd rather have it flat, so I don't use those, but you might have those available in your lab space. Okay, sometimes they look a little bit different, but they generally do the same thing. I have my iron here heated up to about 380 degrees Celsius. Got my sponge, got some solder, got the board. Okay, so let's zoom in on the board. Okay, that's pretty good right there. And you can see this board's already been soldered on a little bit, probably by me. I'm not sure who all. I just found these boards in the lab by past students or by past me. Okay, and when we're soldering, we have a basic process we go through. Okay, so the first thing we always do is we make sure iron is tinned. And when you tin something in the soldering world, the phrase tinning refers to basically applying solder to that thing. You know, there's tin, the metal tin is in solder, so I guess that's why they call it tinning. Okay. I got my iron heated up. I'm going to wipe off the tip in the brass sponge, or you can use the water sponge if you have that. And I'm just going to apply a little bit of solder to the tip of the iron. Okay, you can see it should pretty much instantly melt. A little bit of flux burning off. That smoke is just flux burning off. Nothing to really worry about. Okay, I wouldn't breathe it really, really deep, but nothing really to worry about there. Okay, and then you can put some solder on there again. Just make sure it's nice and clean. Tin the entire tip so it's not burning on one side and coated on the other side. Okay, and once it's nice and clean, then our tip of our iron is tinned. Okay, and the reason why I do that is to keep the iron clean, like I mentioned. There is something in the solder called flux or rosin we talked about before. It keeps the iron clean, it keeps the solder joints clean. It's all around a good option. Okay, and we tin it so the iron is clean. We also tin it because solder is an excellent heat transfer substance, or it transfers heat very well. You know what I'm trying to say. So it transfers heat very well, and so when we take the iron tip and put it onto the board, then it will transfer the heat to the board very well, which is what we want to heat up the pads, or these little squares or circles, these little copper colored things are called pads. We want to heat up the pads so that we have a good solder joint. Okay. So before you start attaching wires or anything like that to your board, you're going to be practicing tinning the pads. So I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of those for you. I'm going to use my flux marker here. Set my iron down for a second actually. My flux marker. I'm going to add some flux to these pads over here. Or you can add some flux with flux paste. I'm going to use some circle ones. It's kind of this little section over here. Okay. And it's also very important to tin your iron anytime you're going to put it down for a minute. Don't let it sit hot with the tip dry. Okay, so put some solder on there before you set it down and before you put it away for the day. Throw some solder on there and then unplug it. It will cool down. The solder will keep the tip clean, and it's not going to hurt anything for next time. You just clean it off. So no big deal. All right. So let's go ahead and do a couple of these pads on the very end first. See if I can move this a little bit so you can see better. Okay. So if you can see those pads here on the very end, they have little tiny holes in them. I know it's hard to see in the video, but very small holes in them. Okay. That's for heat transfer if you're using the pads to actually have a wire on. We also something we have to watch out for when we're soldering. Okay. Because it will draw the solder through the board to the other side. We want it to stay on this side so we can make a nice little pillow. So I'm going to go ahead and take my iron. I'm going to go onto the pad, heat it up. The pad's hot enough, I'm going to feed the solder in from the spool, and then I'll take the spool off and then take the iron off. Okay, so let's try that. So iron on, solder off, iron off. Okay, look at that. Iron on, solder off, iron off. Great. So those pads look excellent in my opinion. They are very shiny. So I can get it to focus here. They're very shiny. They have a nice pillow shape, and they're much taller than these ones actually, which is what I was kind of going for. What we want to do is solder on those pads. Let's see. Oops. In such a way that the solder doesn't bleed through too much. Okay, didn't really bleed through at all there. I did have the blue tack on the back, I just realized, but didn't really bleed through at all there. And you got a nice little pillow, so when we place a wire onto this pad, it can kind of sink into the pillow. Not that these pads are bad, these flatter ones here, but if you attach a wire to a flat pad, it's going to kind of sit on top of the pad more rather than sink into the solder. And you have less surface area transferring the electricity or the heat if it's sitting on top of the pad versus if it's sunk into the little pillow. So that worked out pretty well. I was recording a video for this stuff earlier and I had a different tip on this iron. This much larger chisel tip transfers a lot more heat. Even at the same temperature, 380 degrees Celsius, I was getting much flatter pads because there was so much more heat transfer going on, it would just melt through, okay, and bleed through the other side. Right? We don't really want that. We want it to stay on the side we're working on. So again, temperature plays a big role in our soldering, so does the type of tip you use if you have changeable tips. But if you don't have changeable tips, try playing with that temperature a little bit. All right, let's go back over here and do a few more of these. I'm going to put the blue tack on a different spot just so we can try a couple other square pads. Whoops. And see if we can get it to not bleed through without the blue tack kind of being in the way. Clean off the iron. Again, I tin my iron. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and try a couple of these other square pads. So let's try one of these. Iron on, solder off, iron off. Okay. A better pillow than some of these other ones, but not quite as big as these. So maybe maybe the blue tack did have something to do with it. Let's try another one here. Tin the iron a little bit. Tin the pad. Feed the solder on, iron off. Okay, I went a little bit faster that time. I don't know if you noticed. I was feeding the solder in more quickly, and that allowed me to get more solder on there before it got too hot and flowed through the board. Okay, it isn't all about speed. If I'm not ready to go that fast yet, I can turn the temperature down on my iron to say maybe 325 or something, and that shouldn't heat up the board as much, so I can do that process a little bit easier. Okay, so it's basically either speed or temperature are the two variables you can control when you're soldering. So those two work together. So there's a couple of those square pads. Let's do a couple of these small ones. These are the same principle, they're just smaller. So we'll go ahead and iron on, solder off, iron off. Iron on, solder off, iron off. Iron on, solder off, iron off. Oops. Well, there's a good example right there. Look at that big old peak I got. I don't know if you can see that very well. See that big old peak, big Hershey's Kiss right there? Okay. So that can happen because I have a lot of solder built up on my iron, too much built up on my iron. I need to clean it off. Okay. And retin it. It can also happen because I didn't put enough solder into the pad. The solder likes to be by itself, or be with itself, I should say. It's attracted to itself, so it has surface tension, kind of like water. And so if there's not enough for it to stay attracted to the pad, it will kind of attract itself to the iron as you pull it off. It'll make a big peak like that. Pretty easy to fix though. We just heat it up again, add a little bit more solder. Okay, and get a nice little dome shape there instead of the peak. Looks pretty good. All right. So again, after a couple, I don't know, 4 or 5 pads, depending on how fast you're going, I would clean off the iron and get a fresh tin on it and do another few pads. Let's try a couple of these ones that have holes in them. Should be the same idea. Might just have to go a little bit faster or turn the temperature down a little bit. Oh, not too bad. The pillows are definitely smaller than these ones up here because it's soaking through. Okay. Well, let's see if I can move this in the center of the frame a little bit better. There we go. Okay. And these other ones here on the end have a very small hole in the middle. So again, similar, but just gotta kind of adjust how much solder you feed into the pad. Oops, not enough there. There we go. You got some little solder joints just like that. So let's see if we can hold those up a little bit. Okay, there we go. Some nice little domes. Okay, the board does get pretty hot, so don't burn yourself picking it up. You can see all that kind of wet residue stuff. That's the flux or the rosin kind of just melting out as you do the solder joint, keeping everything nice and clean. That's what you want. You can always clean that off later with rubbing alcohol if you're concerned about the appearance. Okay. So there's some of the small pads. Let's try one of these bigger pads in the middle here and see how we do. These bigger ones have holes through them as well, so you got to be careful you don't let the solder bleed through. I'm going to try it at 380 first. We'll see how we get on with this bigger pad. Tin the iron. Okay, tin the pad. Ooh, see it went right through the board. So it's pretty much flat right there. Okay. It all bled through the backside. So I'd say my iron is maybe too hot. Okay, let's try turning it down a little bit. Kind of go both ways. You can turn it down and try to go and do it a little bit slower. Or you can, oops, got the settings menu again here. Sorry, guys. Okay. This iron has too many menus for me to handle, apparently. I can't tell if it's going down because it's... Oh, there we go. Sorry. Okay. If I accidentally get into the settings on the iron, then it starts cooling the tip off, which is a nice feature. Then I thought it was cooling off because I told it to, not because it was settings, but it was the settings. Anyways. Okay, there's about 300 C. Let's see if that helps a little bit. We'll try this other pad right here. A little bit smaller, but we'll see if we can get it. All right, so tin or iron. Okay, if you have a pencil tip like this, you might need to lay it down and get some extra heat transfer a little bit there. Feed the, oh, there we go. That wasn't too bad. See that little zhoof I did right at the end? Oh, sorry, right in front of the camera. Kind of shot the solder in there real quick at the end to get more solder on there without it flowing through the pad to the back. So I adjusted my speed a lot. Didn't get any bleed through. One, two, second one in. So that's this one right here. No bleed through at all. Got a pretty good tin on the pad. Okay, now of course if you attach a wire, when you attach the wire it might heat up again and melt through. You just kind of have to adjust your temperature and your speed to whatever you're soldering on. And there's a bigger pad there. Let's try this really big one just for fun. Don't know if this will be the right settings for it, but we'll see if we can get it. That's why we have practice boards. Heat the pad. This one's a huge pad. This is not a good tip probably for this type of pad because it's just too, yeah, see it's all flowing through there. So the pad heated up so much because I was on there so long that it all bled through. Let's see if I can do a little bit, feed a little bit more solder in there. Nope, it's all flowing through the other side. There we go, big flow through. So I'd probably turn my temperature down a little bit more in that case. Got a big old blob of solder there on the mat. Whoops. And I turn the temperature down a little bit more in that case. Or the alternative is turn the temperature up higher and go faster. So it's kind of a balance, I guess you could say, what you want to do there. I don't have another big pad to practice on really on this board, but we saw a decent one there. Okay, oops. And so you can use that same technique on the other pads. Turn the temperature down, go a little bit faster with the solder to get it to stay in kind of a pillow shape on the bigger pads. All right, these pads here in the cold area, we can do the same thing with those as the other pads. You're just tinning the pads along. Make sure you get full coverage on the pad. You don't want to have any copper peeking out after you're done. That would be not fully tinned in my opinion. Okay. The more tin you have, to a certain extent, the better contact will be made and if a wire is attached to the pad. Okay. All right, this video is getting a little bit long. Let's finish it up here. So the other thing we have on the board is these kind of long strips. Okay, these are to help you practice your feed speed along with your iron temperature. All right, so what you want to do here is again clean your iron off, tin the iron, okay, and then you'll go and you'll apply it to one of these strips and you'll feed the solder in as you go along. So kind of like this. Tin, heat the strip. Oops, look at that, I got my solder stuck on there. Okay, that's what happens if you leave the solder on too long. Okay, I'm going to heat it up and get it off. There we go. Okay, and we got a nice solder strip. These small ones, let's see if we can get a small one. Very thin, oops, very thin. A little bit tricky, I got too much solder on that one. See how it's kind of sticking off there at the end. But the idea is you're practicing your feed speed as well as your temperature. So play with those variables a little bit. You got a couple strips here and a couple strips over here, okay, on either side of this bridging area, which is what we're going to do next. Okay. This bridging one is kind of tricky to have on the show on camera. It's so glary. Let's see here. See if I can get this up high enough to show you what we're doing at a good angle. Okay, perhaps that'll work. There we go. Not bad. All right, so in this area here, in the instructions talk about tinning all the pads and then bridging 7 of them. So an example here, these 2 pads are tinned, but they're not bridged like these 2 are. So each pair can get bridged together. And the reason why we practice that is because on some flight controllers or other electronics, when you bridge the pads together or unbridge them, you select certain features of the board, typically related to power. So let's say if I bridge these 2 pads, now this pad over here, for example, outputs 12 volts. If I unbridge them, it outputs 5 volts. that's a relatively good example of why you would do this kind of thing, or why we're practicing it. Okay. These bridging pads are relatively far apart, so that's something you want to keep in mind. In real life or in the real flight controllers, they're usually closer together, so this is actually more challenging than real life, which is why it's good practice. Okay, I'm going to tin my iron. We're going to just make sure these pads have a good tin on them already. Looks pretty good. We're going to try to heat them up together and bridge it together. I did this a minute ago before off camera so I could practice. Now it's not working. I think I had a different temperature. Okay. Bridging is rather challenging, and I struggle with it on a regular basis in demonstrations, which is always fun. Let me get my iron back up to 380 where we were at before when I was practicing. See if that helps a little bit. Okay, so again, the idea is to tin both pads and then get them to bridge together and remove your iron, obviously, and have them stay bridged. So we'll up to 380 now. So tin, tin, bridge, bridge. There we go. Okay. It's a pretty big bridge, but again, this is a large gap that we're jumping. So one thing I would recommend you try is leaving the solder in there a little bit longer than you normally would on one of these pads, and that can help bridge the gap after you get the iron off. Let's try another one. Let's de-bridge these ones up here. Okay, so see I just kind of brought that solder off and de-bridge those two. We're going to re-tin them. There we go, and then we're going to kind of hold the iron across both of them and fill in some solder. And leave the solder on there a little bit longer. There we go. And we got a nice bridge right there. Okay. So that's the bridging area. These pads you can bridge other pads, of course, but this is designed to help you practice that. All right. Zoom back out a little bit. Last thing I'm going to show you in this video is the castellated holes on the sides of the board. So these castellated pads run around the edge of the board. There's some really big ones right here. Okay. And there's small ones on the other three edges of the board. So let's show you a couple of these. So when you do castellated pads, sometimes it's helpful to orient the board vertically. Okay, oops, if I can put it in camera, it would be helpful too. Okay, it's going to be out of focus a little bit. I apologize. It's just hard to focus on a vertical edge like this. But hopefully you get the idea. Whoops. My helping hands help me hold this in place, perhaps. There we go. Okay, and so same idea here. We're going to clean and tin our iron. We're going to then apply heat to the pad and then feed the solder in. So heat, solder, solder off, iron off. Iron on, solder off, iron off. Iron on, solder off, iron off. Okay, let's do a couple closer over here. Well, the focus is kind of changing on the camera. Solder on, or iron on, solder off, iron off. Okay, so we did a few along that strip. Let's take a look at those in a different angle so we can see what's going on. Okay, so if you look here, you can see these ones along the top are the ones I was just doing right now, these castellated holes. Okay, and the reason why I oriented the board vertically was because these castellated holes kind of have 3 dimensions or 3 sides. 1, 2, 3. And just like on these other ones, when we tin the pad, we want to make sure the pad is completely covered. We don't have any copper still peeking out from the corners. Okay, so when we tin a pad, we want to make sure we get this side. We want to make sure we get this side. We want to make sure we get this side. Okay, if you don't, then it's not fully tinned. And so if you orient the board vertically and heat the solder up, it will then, flow down to either side. You can, of course, just tin one side, flip it over, tin the other side, and as long as everything heats up and melts together and cools together, you'll have a good solder joint. But I find it fairly easy to do a vertical and just have it flow down as it's still hot. Okay, on these big ones, you might need to do separate tinning and join it together. That's okay, like I said, as long as it melts together, or heats up all together, and then cools together, you still have a good solder joint. If you just do a blob over here and a blob over here, and they don't ever heat each other up or get joined together, then that's not really a good solder joint. Okay. Castellated holes you can see over here are used like in this example here. We have these wires attached to the board. It's got a big plug on it. But the idea is you attach the wires in a 90-degree fashion to the board. Okay, that's what the castellated holes are for. Well, all right, well that should take care of it. In terms of the first part of that assignment, basically all the tinning stuff, you should have explanation for that now. And in the next video, we'll do a little bit more with wires. Thanks for watching.